This is part 3 of a series on the 1969 murder of Teresa Martin, 14-year-old girl found asphyxiated against the wall of a parking lot tavern in Montreal North. But before we continue talking about Teresa Martin, I got to talk about 10 other murders. So we got to clear the decks with those murders to give some context before we get back to Teresa Martin. Life isn't fair. Justice is blind and dysfunctional. And some cops aren't smart and dedicated, like on television. This is Who Killed Teresa. Forget about everything you know that came after. For now, for the purposes of today's episode, it's February 1970. So it's 4 months later from that fall when Teresa was found. And this is the tagline presented at the beginning of that month's Hello Police. Are there truly in the streets of Montreal and its region one of these monster murderers or one of these sexual maniacs we know and have seen in the pages of books and in movies who violate their victims, their prey of choice being young girls at the flower of their youth? The following are 8 young girls murdered by strangulation, with the murderer still being sought. And then LO gives you a catalog, and I'm just going to read through the list here. Céline Gagnon, age 22, December 28, 1966 in Quebec. Normand Vaillancourt, age 21, July 23, 1968 in Montreal. Claudia Beauvais, age 22, July 8, 1969 in Verdun. Teresa Martin, age 14, September 13, 1969 in Montreal. Shirley Odette, age 20, October 3, 1969 in Montreal. Marielle Archambault, age 20, November 26, 1969 in Montreal. Linda Silverman, age 15, January 4th, 1970 in Piedmont. Jean Way, age 24, January 17th, 1970 in Montreal. Of the 8 cases of young women strangled, 4 do not appear connected, but the other 4 appear to be of the same origin. From this was born the theory of the existence of several stranglers for the first cases, and the possibility of one true maniac strangler of the kind the city of Boston knew a few years ago for the other 4. That's Hello Police, February 1st. Yeah, February 1st, 1969. And you know that people were thinking of these cases in the context of Teresa Martin because this actual article was found in the LO police file along with photos and other items. So they were thinking about it, like an old yellow copy of it. It's a page 3 article, but I'm sure there was a byline on the front page. Begins with a picture of Normand Vaillancourt. Y a-t-il une ou plaisir tueurs? It says, and then so Allo Police then provides profiles of the 8 cases, beginning with the 4 cases they believe are not connected. So there's like 2 subsets. The 4 could be miscellaneous, what they call stranglers. The other 4, they suspect one strangler. With these things, it's hard to tell who's wagging the dog here. Is Allo driving the story? Is the police driving the story? Is the police feeding Allo to write this? Is Allo doing this independently based on knowledge that they have? Is there a rogue officer within the force who's breaking ranks and feeding them stories? What today we'd know as a whistleblower. I think it'd be best. I did a summary of these cases, and on the website teresaallore.com, TheresaAllore.com. I will post the summary. There's a lot of information here, so I'll post the summaries along with a picture of each of the victims. Some of these victims you already know. I'm quite confident some of them you've never even heard of. So the first one, and this is only in the order that they presented them. So it's kind of a scattered order. You could reshuffle the deck for your own meaning. Some of these things I'll say something about maybe at the end, maybe as we go. Some of it I'm just going to leave open-ended. For the people who have listened to this podcast, I think a lot of things will pop for you, and I'm not going to emphasize the popping. You know now. Let it be what it is to you and your own sleuthing. So the first is the Quebec City girl, Céline Gagnon. So she lived in a basement apartment with several friends at 53 Rue des Épinettes in the Limoilou quartier quarter, Limoilou, in that area of Quebec City. She worked as a secretary at a hospital in the city. She was attacked on her way home from work around 5:15 p.m. in the evening, just after Christmas, December 28th, 1966. So she leaves her office around 5. It's about a half-hour walk. So midway to her home, her apartment, Ms. Gagnon, excuse me, I'm editing. Ms. Gagnon is attacked. And when she screamed, apparently her assailant stabbed her in the face, then proceeded to strangle and rape her. When police found the body, her clothing had been strewn around the crime scene. Robbery was not a motive, as her purse was found nearby, and there's all kinds of money in it. And there were signs of staging of the body, although it as if it had been placed carefully in the snow. Number 2 is Claudia Beauvais, the Verdun case. Verdun is on the island of Montreal. It's a community a little bit south of Pointe Saint Charles, the Point, around the Pointe Claire region, almost towards the West Island, La Salle area. So Claudia Beauvais, she was 22 years old, and she's First Nations from what the paper calls Kanawanga, which we now know as Kanawake Reserve on the south shore of Montreal. So the Hélène Urtubise area around St. Catherine. The paper describes her as having, quote, the mental state of a 4 or 5-year-old child, end quote. And she was interned at the Douglas Memorial Psychiatric Institution in Verdun since 1965, so for about 4 years. She was receiving treatment, but she's not confined to her room or to her ward. She's free to roam outside the institution and to visit her parents on weekends. On the evening of July 3rd, 1969, so for context, this is approximately 2 months before the murder of Teresa Martin, July 3rd, 1969, Claudia went to see a movie screened at the Douglas campus, and she did not return to her room. 5 days later, on July 8th, her mutilated body was found hidden in some bushes. Allo police states, it was evident a venerable human monster was responsible, as the butchery was indescribable. And then Allo police then goes on to describe the butchery that was indescribable. I'm not going to describe it. You can imagine. Stabbed quite brutally. And the article goes on to describe how police did not suspect any of the 2,000 patients at the Douglas Institute. And the premise was searched, and there was no traces found of blood or clothing, evidence. Nothing was found within the residence, and this led to suspicions that the perpetrator was either a visitor to the Douglas Institute or possibly an outpatient. Teresa Martin. Now, what's interesting is 4 months later, remember the article is written in February, what is said or possibly what is not said about Teresa Martin in February of 1970. The article says she appeared much older than her 14 years, but she lived with her parents and she had, quote, regular habits. She attended the convent, or Regina Sancta, where she was a, quote, brilliant student. On the evening of her death, she received permission to go to the movies at Galerie d'Anjou. Again, Allo police stresses to see the film Je Perverse. She took the number 41 bus home around 11 p.m. Approximately 4 hours later, her body was found in the parking lot of the Vieux Cypress Tavern on Henri Bourassa, approximately a mile from her home. She was seated against the wall of the tavern in bare feet without shoes. And the autopsy revealed she had been asphyxiated. So we begin the article by saying 8 strangled women, yet one was not really strangled. She was asphyxiated. Her clothing was not disheveled. She probably died when her assailant placed his hand over her mouth to stop her from screaming. Allo police stresses that she was, quote, definitely not raped. And here we get some new information. Allo police says she was possibly killed for, quote, some revenge, end quote. Some revenge. What does that mean? That's interesting. I would pocket that for now. We'll return to it. Finally, they point out the mysterious tattoo on her abdomen, FV, Frenchie, I love you. And that this was made after her death. I doubt that. I believe the screaming with the hand over the mouth was made at the cause of the tattoo. It's just my opinion. And finally, there were no traces of drugs or alcohol in her system, and police are still searching for her assassin. Finally, in this last group of what the paper believes are unrelated murders, and to let the cat out of the bag, I tend to believe them. I think these are scattered murders, possibly in one article to have 8 to create hysteria, which we'll get to this. The paper definitely did. Linda Silverman, 15-year-old, was found murdered January 4th, 1970 in Piedmont, which is the Laurentian region north of Montreal, skiing area. Silverman was from an affluent family. Her father was a noted psychiatrist, Dr. Marvin Silverman, and they lived in Ottawa. And she was found dead in a snowbank. The body showed no signs of violence, no rape, except she appeared to have been strangled from the cord on her ski jacket. She'd been with a friend named Karine Eidinger, spending the weekend skiing near Saint-Agathe and Saint-Sauveur, just north of Saint-Jerome. That's for Quebec professionals only. The Silverman murder. This murder, it kind of reminds me. It's much later, but of the death of Suzanne Yell, found July 14th, 1984, on the side of the road in Mont-Tremblant. She'd been out drinking the night before in the Saint-Jovite area. I don't know. You don't get a lot of cases north in that area of murders. You get body dumps up there. It's murdered somewhere else and then dumped north of Montreal. But few in the skiing area. This is 15 years later, one in the winter, one in the summer. It just reminded me. That's all. So stop there for a moment, and I would say nothing. Quebec City murder. We have Verdun. We have North Montreal with Teresa Martin, and we have the Laurentians via Ottawa. Nothing yet that particularly stands out to me. Let's continue. So, Allo Police next presents the 4 cases that, in their opinion, possibly the police's opinion at this point, I think it was the police's opinion, are connected, beginning with Norma Vaillancourt. So Norma Vaillancourt was found naked on the bed of her Davidson Street apartment in Montreal on July 23rd, 1968. So between the girl at the Douglas Institute in Verdun and Teresa Martin. She's a 21-year-old student. She'd been sexually assaulted. Police suspected her assailant knew her, as there had been no forced entry into the apartment. Her assailant removed the sheets and pillowcases from the apartment and washed the dead victim's body before leaving. In terms of aphilia, that's not unusual. The washing of a victim, it happens quite often. So don't think that's whoa. What's that about? It's common. Shirley Odette. Odette was found 15 months later, October 3rd, 1969, so a month after Teresa Martin, or maybe more like 3 weeks, strangled in the backyard near her Dorchester Boulevard apartment in Montreal. The 20-year-old was a former patient of the Douglas Memorial Psychiatric Institute in Verdun. Isn't that interesting? Like with Norma Vaillancourt, police initially believed Odette died by accident or suicide. Like Vaillancourt, she had been raped and strangled, and Odette had bite marks on her breasts. Her boyfriend, Kenneth Ehlert, noted that prior to her murder, Odette had been nervous and unable to sleep. And when in this state, it was Odette's habit to sit outside her apartment building. 2 to go. Marielle Archambault. Less than 2 months later, after the Odette slaying, November 26, 1969, 20-year-old Marielle Archambault was found dead on the couch of her apartment on Ontario Avenue in Montreal. Again, police believe she had died initially of natural causes or had committed suicide. Again, the autopsy indicated Archambault had been raped and strangled. Again, there were bite marks on the breasts. Archambault worked at a jewelry store in Place Ville-Marie, and on the day of her murder, she was observed in the jewelry store with a suave young man who she introduced as Bill. The two left together from the jewelry store at the end of Archambault's shift, and that's the last anyone saw of Marielle Archambault. And then finally there's Jean Way, 24-year-old, shared an apartment with a friend on Lincoln Street in Montreal. Both young women worked at the Royal Victoria Hospital. So there's that hospital link. We've heard this many times. And that's just to me to suggest that hospital workers were easy prey for a variety of reasons. On January 16th, 1970, her boyfriend, Brian Caulfield, found Way strangled on her bed. She had been sexually assaulted, but there were no signs of mutilation. We'll get to that. Authorities believed her assailant was interrupted when earlier in the evening her boyfriend showed up for a planned date, but received no response when he knocked at the door. Now, most definitely, I can tell you that's a summary of the articles, but Way, Archambault, Odette all had signs of mutilation, being bite marks on their breasts. And by the time of the Jean Way murder in January of 1970, the city of Montreal descended into a state of what I would call mayhem, pondering the possibility of the Montreal strangler. Then quite suddenly the strangulation murders stopped. And what we know now, and I think by now most of you have already guessed this, is that the final 3 murders, Odette, Archambault, Way, were the work of the serial killer Wayne Bowden, who by February he had fled Montreal and he would commit one final murder in Calgary, the strangulation of high school teacher Elizabeth Ann Porteous, before his apprehension. And the LO Police article, it ends with LO Police trying to assure their readership that a Montreal strangler did not exist. And the final entry is, but, quote, the murderous sadist truly existed.
Un garçon ne va jamais jusqu'au bout comme une fille. Je veux dire, une fille, t'as souvent, quand on discute, on va plus loin que nos idées. Je veux dire, des fois, on dépasse un peu ce qu'on voudrait dire, hein. Pour un garçon, il peut pas concevoir qu'on puisse faire ça. Il faut toujours qu'il y ait une certaine limite dans ce qu'on dit.
Moi, j'aime autant un gars qui se ferme, qui dit rien, qu'un gars qui parle toujours pour rien dire.
Je sais pas. Par exemple, on fait les folles.
We'll stop there for a moment. Some things I find interesting about this is so LO runs this article basically saying, you know, there could be a serial killer out there, and proceeds to show 8 photographs of 8 women, and I'm like, if this sounds familiar to you, like, where have I seen this before? Well, we've talked about this. LO police in the 70s were warning the community and the police that they had the problems with a serial killer in the late 70s with the Cameron Monast, Helena Hawks, etc. murders. I mean, the photos were lined up and very similar, you know, sort of catalog descriptions of their murders were included, and it was discounted. So that's the 70s. Cut to the early 90s, La Presse runs an article, again cataloging women. This time they show a map with photos pointing towards where they were found, saying you've got a serious problem with a serial killer. And it's ignored. So that you look back at the 60s and you see the pattern recognition here of this constantly, you know, this was, you know, when I read it in the 70s, I was like, well, this is something new. This is something unique. Well, it wasn't anything unique. It happened again in the 70s, and it was or in the 90s, and it was ignored. And it had happened in the past in the 60s, and it was ignored. And the problem here, particularly, again, is that you know, LO Police is the Cassandra here. LO Police is the one crying that there's fire in the movie theater, and a police officer had gone on record and said, you know, we've got a psychopath on our hands, particularly with the murders involving entry into women's apartments. You know, the English papers refused to acknowledge it. The Gazette would not run a story on this. A month later, March, like in March of 1970, LO Police's theory is picked up by the English newspapers, but not in Montreal. Their stories are run in Windsor, in Saskatoon, Calgary, Edmonton, Ottawa, Manitoba. But the Gazette does not cover it. Whether the Montreal Star did or not, we don't know, but that's a private archive. But, for example, the Windsor Star version of the LO Police article, the headline reads, Montreal police think killer will strike again. And they ignore the first 4 murders because those ones are believed to be kind of a balkanization, possibly several prayers, and they focus on Odette, Vaillancourt, Way, and Archambault. And some of the language is interesting in this article. I'll just read a little bit here. This is from the Windsor article. And there's, again, it's an AP piece because there's no reporter associated with it. Investigators are puzzled by one aspect of the murders. They say the killer must have had a hypnotic way about him. And then it goes on. It says the stranglings were done with such a delicate touch, police say, that the victim showed no agonized expressions of a last desperate attempt to live. No, that's very poetic, but I really question the authenticity of that. And I wonder, since LO Police brought it up, the effect of a phenom like the Boston Strangler. Now, the Boston Strangler, Albert DeSalvo, was active in the early 60s in the Boston area, reputedly responsible for dozens of murders, although there's some who suggest that there was a copycat. The film, The Boston Strangler, right? And I think that's really what Hello Police is alluding to. Not the actual phenomena, but they're talking about the Tony Curtis film, which was released in the fall of '68. So it was very much in the zeitgeist. And so when we get a lot of these references, like a hypnotic quality, and he lulls them to sleep, I think we're really talking about Tony Curtis, which, by the way, the movie The Boston Strangler is a perfectly awful and derivative film. Derivative in the sense that it's highly referential. It's being polite to Michael Powell's Peeping Tom, which was made in the 1960s. Peeping Tom effectively ruined Michael Powell's career because it was so controversial at the time, about a serial killer. Peeping Tom in itself, highly influenced by Hitchcock, 1954, 55, Rear Window, isn't it? It's Grace Kelly who says to Jimmy Stewart, "We've become a nation of peeping Toms." Jimmy Stewart's character is a photographer. He photographs, right, Raymond Burr, the suspected murderer, across the apartments. Michael Powell was admittedly influenced by Hitchcock. Of course, the mid-'60s, you get a movie like The Collector with Terence Stamp, which itself is highly influenced by Powell. And then, of course, we get The Boston Strangler, which is, which I had seen at an early age on TV as a kid in Montreal, definitely. Tony Curtis is this matinee idol who they're trying to convince us is a serial killer, dress him in a pea coat and a night watch cap. And I think every time he murders, he's lit in this garish green light. I think a lot with the cases of, when they didn't know who this killer was, they're really talking about the phenom of the Boston Strangler. But when Wayne Bowden is caught, you begin to wait. It's like, well, wait a minute, maybe what's going on here? Who's influencing who? Because Bowden does turn out to be very much like the profile they had presented. He's this guy who apparently he had dated a lot of the victims. He'd met them in discos and things like this, and so he would have easily gained entry to their apartment and seduced them, and then strangled and murdered them. It's a little different from De Silva. What I find interesting in De Silva is, so De Silva's mid-60s. By the late 70s, Montreal has the cases of the plumber rapist who's gaining entry to women's apartments by pretending to be a handyman or a plumber. Of course, this was De Silva's MO, most definitely. The plumber rapist becomes, in full bloom, William Fife, the serial killer, William Fife. And so you wonder, well, did William Fife growing up, if I saw The Boston Strangler on CFCF 12 as a kid, and by the way, Peeping Tom, I think Peeping Tom I saw really young on The Late Show, like on CFCF 12, I believe around 73, 74. If I saw these movies, did someone like Wayne Bowden, did someone like William Fife also see these films, and did they provide a jumping off point, an inspiration to their later sexual murders? The other thing I find interesting about Wayne Bowden, and there's little I find interesting about Wayne Bowden, here's this guy who commits a series of murders in Quebec, and then he fucks off to Calgary, right? And it's Calgary who eventually collars him and makes the arrest for a murder in Calgary. And he's sentenced for the murder in Calgary before attention turns to him for the Montreal murders. Now, where have I heard this before? Do I not know of a guy from Montreal or from Quebec who murdered a bunch of women, allegedly, and then went to Calgary, and then in 1993 committed a murder of a 7-Eleven clerk and was apprehended by the Calgary police. And the Quebec police have been urged for decades now to look at this guy, Luc Gregoire, and they never did. Very, very curious. Bowden, Bowden freely admitted to the Montreal crimes and sort of said it was bizarre. He said, it wasn't like me. I don't know why I did it. Bowden, I may have talked about this before. It's worth saying again. He's sentenced to, I believe, Archambault. He was incarcerated north of Montreal. And 5 years into a life sentence, he managed to get an American Express card. I don't know how corrections manage that, but he managed to get not only did he manage to get an American Express card, he managed to get day parole. A murderer, a serial killer, right, manages to get day parole. So he's out with his parole officer at the Kon-Tiki restaurant, this Polynesian restaurant, very much like Trader Vic's if you're an American. These umbrella drinks and things like that. So he's at the Kon-Tiki, eating a popo platter with his corrections officer in the afternoon, and at the Mount Royal Hotel, and he goes to the bathroom to take a leak, and apparently crawls out the window, or he sneaks out of the Kon-Tiki, and he's on the lam. He's caught, I believe, the next day or a few days later, having a drink, in some Crescent Street restaurant or whatever, and taken back to prison where he belonged. And of course, there was a dust up about how he got the credit card and, what was he doing out in the first place or in the second place. And a lot of finger pointing and we'll never do that again. We know now not to do that. But of course, it's quickly forgotten. Bowden ends up dying of skin cancer years later in the Kingston Pen, and that's the last we hear of Wayne Bowden. Well, you know what happened with the last three cases, but it's good to give some updates about these other cases because it's interesting. So the first one, the Quebec City one, Céline Gagnon, found over Christmas in the snowbank. In 1972, a young man from Sept-Îles walks into a police station and he declares himself the murderer of Céline Gagnon. And because he was a juvenile offender at the time of the murder, a judge sentences him to 23 months in prison. The Gagnon family took a civil action to court demanding reimbursements totaling $21,000 to cover funeral expenses for their daughter. That's quite a funeral. But the Gagnon family were denied restitution. Norma Vaillancourt. Now, because the MO was so similar, she's found naked in her apartment. Wayne Bowden was initially believed to have murdered Norman Vaillancourt, but in 1994, Raymond Sauvé was convicted of Vaillancourt's death and sentenced to 10 years in prison. And as you can imagine, the family believed that 10 years was not enough for a life. Claudia Beauvais, This is the Kahnawake Native Reserve woman in the Verdun institution. As you can imagine, because she was First Nations, the Beauvais case generated the least amount of media attention. Initially, some focus went to a 34-year-old taxi driver from Toronto. He's held for questioning, let go. He had been found lurking around the wooded area where Beauvais was found. Later, a 35-year-old Montrealer became a suspect. By mid-July, police gave a statement that, quote, "The condition of the victim's body leads us to believe we are dealing with a mentally deranged person who may strike again." So this is the summer of '69, the lead up to Teresa Martin's murder. So there's a lot of mayhem going on here, right? We've got in the summer of '69, we've got serious consideration of a maniac on the loose. Over the winter, we've got the guy, the police saying we got a psychopath on the loose. And note the language in all of this, right? The monster, a sexual maniacs, a disturbed sadist. All of this is never very helpful, particularly when then you change the MO and say, well, no, wait, we got a charming guy who looks just like us. Yeah, no kidding, he looks just like you. They all do. So stop calling them monsters. Because I think we're a little weary to this today, but back in the day, I think a lot of people literally thought monsters, right? Something that looked like the Golem or the Hunchback of Notre Dame. It's like, well, if I see that, I'll know. But the guy who looks like a businessman, a.k.a., Wayne Bowden, in a trench coat and tie and nice kept hair, I'm not going to suspect him because you told me not to suspect him. So in 1973, back to the Claudia Beauvais case, so 4 years later, suspicions turned to an offender named William Bill Market, also known as Bill Mason and Bill Reed. And he's suspected of killing 3 women since 1969. The media doesn't specify which women. And Market went to trial for the 1973 stabbing death of Christine Harding in her St. Antoine Street apartment. Harding had been a patient at the Douglas Memorial Psychiatric Institute in Verdun. He was originally from Verdun and suspected of the death of Beauvais and was all set to stand trial for her murder, but the Crown suddenly withdrew the charge. And Claudia Beauvais' murder remains unsolved. But what's interesting here is, so now we got, from what little we know about Bill Market, we got another guy gaining entry to apartments and killing women. We've also got a guy who potentially is quite savage in the matter of the nature of the Claudia Beauvais murder. So we got 2 guys. The Teresa Martin case, of course, we will update you on that in future podcasts. Shirley Odette, Marielle Archambault, and Jean Way, we already know. That's Wayne Bowden, and Bowden was sentenced to 3 life terms. Finally, there's Linda Silverman. This is interesting. Age 15, the Piedmont girl who came from a very prominent Ottawa family. And as you might expect, because she came from a prominent Ottawa family, she received front page coverage in all Canadian media. By the summer of 1970, she gets a reward offering. The Quebec Department of Justice offers a $5,000 reward. Didn't see a reward for Claudia Beauvais. Near the 1-year anniversary of her death, a coroner's inquest was ordered. Didn't see a coroner's inquest for Ms. Vaillancourt. And despite a medical expert testifying that Silverman was effectively hanged, police were now operating on a theory that the 15-year-old girl may have died accidentally. So, again, we have this theme of police and their go-to backfield in motion approach of, well, it was an accident. We thought it was a murder, but it's probably an accident or suicide, right? Suicide or accident are natural causes. By January 12th, 1971, the inquest is shuttered, with the head lawyer stating the inquest will reopen only when I feel a new piece of testimony will shed light on the case. That inquest was never reopened, and Linda Silverman's death remains unsolved. Yeah, my beef with the Quebec police, these guys always, we worked hard. Yeah. Me and Joe, we had to do a knock and talk and cordon off the area, and do a ground search. It was tough. We work hard on these cases. If your police are offspring of the police, I'm allowed my point of view, you're allowed yours. But police get paid the big bucks and have the high-profile jobs, so they got to take the knocks. When Wayne Bowden was finally arrested in 1971, Quebec police immediately took credit for Calgary's efforts. Montreal police homicide cop Guy Gaudreau stated the strangulation murders were, quote, one of the toughest cases we've ever had to solve, end quote. What did you do? One of the toughest cases you had to solve. What did you do? The lack of humility and perspective, the what island of ego and self-importance could you possibly be living on with that statement? Bowden was only collared for the Montreal murders when an observant Calgary journalist tipped Montreal police that the murder of Elizabeth Ann Porteous, the schoolteacher, looked a lot like Montreal's vampire killer, which was the moniker that Wayne Bowden ended up wearing. And in actual fact, Montreal police spent hundreds of hours searching for who they believed to be their suspect, a guy named Bill. Yes, Bill. They even produced this mysterious photo of Bill that they alleged was the suspect. This was released in the papers. All kinds of people went on a witch hunt trying to find this Bill, who it was not a photo, I'll tell you right now, of either Bill Market or of Wayne Bowden. It ultimately turned up to be a photo of one of the victim's fathers. So they wasted all this time. And, once in custody, Bowden immediately and freely admitted to Calgary investigators that he had murdered the 3 Montreal women. So Montreal police's toughest case to solve was effectively handed to them on a silver platter. So what of this Bill? So we got Bill Market, right? Suspected of murders in 1969 and thereafter. And we got Wayne Bowden, and we got one of the victims saying she left with the bill. Was that Bill Market actually who she left with? Or was it, I mean, I wouldn't, Bowden was a clever guy. I wouldn't put it past Bowden to have known, through Jungle Telegraph, through channels, that there was actually another murderer operating at the time, and, that his name was Bill. Or hearing that police were looking for a Bill, that Bowden began to call himself Bill. That I wouldn't put that past Bowden at all.
I bless you madly, sadly as I tie my shoes. I love you badly, just in time at times, I guess. Because of you, I need to rest. Because it's you that sets the test.
I guess I'd close with saying, so this is a lot that was going on, 69 and 70, right? So we have ground zero with this podcast for the moment, which is Teresa Martin, September 13th, 1969. But the added context of all these other murders occurring, and the possibility of multiple serial killers acting in the Montreal area. If you know your history, and 69 and 70, I mean, an incredibly tumultuous time in Montreal. February 69, you have the bombing of the Montreal Stock Exchange by the FLQ. And you had bombings going on for the decade. But that was probably the one that's the one everyone remembers. They don't really remember the armory, etc., post office boxes and stuff. The stock exchange hit at the heart of English Montreal business. Then in September 28th, so 2 weeks after Teresa Martin's murder, Mayor Jean Drapeau's home was bombed. We'll get into a little later about some of the other things. The Murray Hill bus riots, which happened in October. So all of this is going on, and that's to say, so when we finally arrive at, the date of this article, February 1st, 1970, of course, Bowden is eventually caught, but Teresa Martin kind of gets washed out in everything else that was going on at the time. From the FLQ situation to Wayne Bowden's arrest in 71. But the hysteria around strangulation murders, nobody's really thinking about the asphyxiation of a girl in Montreal North to the degree that they're thinking about people in the central business district, essentially, which is what it was, women living and working in downtown Montreal-ish. The focus gets pulled there. And the clock is really running down on the Martin murder, and what will really kick things to the foreground, again, if you know your history, is that by October 1970 we hit the October crisis and the kidnapping of Trade Minister Pierre Laporte and he's the deputy premier Pierre Laporte and British Trade Commissioner James Cross in October 1970. By that time, October in 1970, that's it. All investigative efforts for all police forces, major police forces, the Montreal Police, the Sûreté de Québec, the RCMP for that matter, switch focus to hunting kidnappers and killers and terrorists. And a case like a Teresa Martin is not going to get much traction. So she's already pushed to the side in the early part of the year by this serial killer stuff. And the case is about to get kicked to the curb once again by the fall, by the October crisis. So you have this small window in the spring, early summer, in which to possibly solve the murder. So what happened? What happened in that corridor? That's the subject of another podcast, not for today.
Of the glory untold dream where all is gone and gone is just a word.
As always, if you like what you hear, please give us a 5-star rating on iTunes would be best, on Apple Podcasts. Social media, you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all of that. To find all of that, the best place to go is the website, teresallore.com, TheresaAllure.com. There are links to all those social media pages there for that, to follow, to discuss, etc., etc. There's that. Listening. We are now finally on Amazon Podcasts. So if you go to Amazon, you can listen there. Amazon is is an influencer I don't want to ignore. So if you can't find us on Apple or Stitcher or Spreaker or Spotify, you can now find us on Amazon Podcasts. Just ask Alexa or Echo. We started today with Tommy James and the Shondells, Crimson and Clover, which was Teresa Martin's favorite song. I'm told she would listen to that over and over. Tommy James and the Shondells, I didn't know this. Their record company in the day, in the 60s, they were based in New Jersey, was a front for racketeering for the mafia. Tommy James lost all kinds of money, proceeds through this money laundering operation with the mob. I didn't know. I don't know that much about Tommy James and the Shondells. I do now. This song I've listened to over and over. There's a quality to it. We'll go out today with David Bowie's Signet Committee, also from Crimson and Clover, I think it's 67. Signet Committee from Bowie's first album in 1969, for no other reason than there's a quality to the sound that reminds me of Crimson and Clover. I would imagine producer Tony Visconti had heard that record and said, let's get a little bit of that element in this track. So we'll leave you today with that. That's our podcast. This has been Who Killed Teresa? I'm John Allure. Have yourselves a great